The opinions expressed in the following are those of its participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the producers and the Six Talk Podcast Network. Also, the following contains mature material and mild language, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Discretion is advised.
And the recording is running on this Monday night, June 22nd, 2020. This is digest number 4 of the Anime Roundtable version 2. Once again, if you have any comments, animeroundtable@gmail.com is our email. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Anime Roundtable and animeroundtable.com for our website and blog. And don't forget to leave us a review on Apple or Google Podcasts or wherever you get your material. So the original purpose of the digests was to give a quick discussion on one topic or headline in a timely manner. And much like everything else concerning the history of this podcast, it hasn't gone that way, except maybe tonight. In a timely follow-up to what we talked about last week on Studio Ghibli works on Canadian streaming services, word came down today that Netflix Canada has acquired the rights to the entire catalog of 21 features. And so we want to give an instant analysis and thoughts to that news. Mike Nicolas here at the 6 Point Studio in the Toronto West End again. James Austin and Kevin Ng join me as well from their homes in the suburbs out west. And this time around, we're joined by Jesse Betteridge from the Zannen Canada podcast, way out west in Vancouver.
Much further west.
Yes. Well, his presence makes this a perfect chance to talk about this. So, Jesse, thanks for joining us tonight on such short notice, especially since I know you're coming off of work for the day there.
I just came off of yet another wonderful remote shift, and I'm exhausted, but I'm, always happy to be on the show, and definitely excited to talk about Studio Ghibli streaming.
Well, you have a couple chances to brag in the next couple minutes. First reaction, well, the first word I got of it was from a friend on his Facebook page, and then I want to see if you knew about it. Then I looked at your Twitter as I was contacting you, and then you put up the words resolved faster than expected. So what's your initial reaction, though, Jesse? And then I'll ask you the other two.
My initial reaction is not very terribly surprised. The fact that Crave and other services didn't have these films up right away at the same time that HBO Max had them in the United States shows that they probably weren't willing to put up the money for them, because Studio Ghibli films, I'm sure, were extravagantly expensive to get the streaming rights for. On that note, are we going to have a chance to kind of go over just what the situation is with Studio Ghibli streaming overall?
I just want to get an initial reaction from James and Kevin
okay.
first,
Yeah,
and then we can start to go through the genesis of all of this, just quickly, like the quick history. James, what's your initial thought, just in a couple seconds?
As just like Jesse, nothing really surprising on this front. It was just a matter of who G-Kids went to, because they were probably the ones that were doing it on behalf of Ghibli and stuff like that for North American market. And it was either going to be Bell Media or it was going to be Netflix. So they probably played it off each other, and it somehow got resolved quicker than any of us thought.
Kevin?
I guess I should have seen this coming. I was just thinking that maybe, as per last episode, I was thinking maybe Bell was just sitting on it for whatever reason, but I think that this is as good of a resolution as we could have gotten, and about time.
From my standpoint, I'm looking at this as a consumer, and I can cancel my Crave subscription, I think, by the end of the month. Even though Last Week Tonight is still a good hook for me.
That's what I was going to say. You don't want to watch John Oliver anymore?
Oh, I'm a huge fan. So
you can still get the bulk of each episode on YouTube every week.
Wait a
minute. Or did they start blocking those? Did they start blocking those?
I don't think so. I was able to watch them.
I know sometimes it's region locked, but I think it's still easy to find. And
look, Mike, just find a family member who has a cable subscription and mooch off of their login. That's how everyone else does it, okay?
That's how it works a lot of the time. And on top of that, actually the show will be on hiatus for much of July anyway. So
there you go.
Where do we start? Because I know that the announcement for Studio Ghibli stuff on Netflix was in late January, so I guess that's sort of where we start.
Well, Mike, I think it starts a little earlier than that, because for the longest time it was believed that that Studio Ghibli simply did not want their content available digitally at all. They only wanted it to be distributed either theatrically or on home video. And
Yeah,
they held this stance for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they want that movie theater experience and stuff like that, and we kept hearing that for years, right?
So, what happened then? What happened here? Okay, before that, I think in the fall, HBO Max was announced to get the streaming rights for obviously the US, but many thought it would have been Canada as well. So it's not just January. We can go back into the fall, I believe.
And even before that, G Kids kind of made an earth-shattering announcement when they said that they were offering the films to purchase, download to own.
That's what I was hearing too. Yeah, download to own was the first wave and stuff like that. And there were, I think it was Polygon had the article, and then there was confusion, and then the dust settled.
Yeah. Basically, they had that article. I can't remember who had that interview on there. I think it was with Toshio Suzuki, where he said that Studio Ghibli films would never be made available digitally. And then, like, within, I think, 72 hours, it was announced that the films would be made available download to own, and that HBO Max would be streaming them in the United States when the service launched in 2020. So, we got a laugh out of that.
Yeah, and I think they said that reporting, unfortunately, he had looked and sourced it from other things. They hadn't exactly gone to the source. It wasn't primary sources, so that kind of looked really bad on them, to say the least. Because I think it was almost next day that G-Kids made that announcement, and it's like, how did that happen?
So your belief is like this has been an ongoing thing. It sounded like we had to kind of do a little bit of massaging here and there.
But I think it's something that has developed over time too, Mike, because you look at Disney and stuff like that, how it felt like they just kind of sat, like the creators at Disney knew what Ghibli was and the value of it, but it seemed everyone above didn't, and they kind of lost sight of what they had and just kept on sitting on things because, hey, if it had been an alternate reality, maybe it would have been on Disney Plus, but it wasn't. And then G Kids, I guess, through the film festival they have in New York, and they were building their brand and stuff like that, brought the trust from Ghibli, and they've been doing those Ghibli fests. So they've been showing the films in the theater the way they want. So you have that aspect of it, and they're still doing it. And then that probably brought on the education and stuff like that, that they were able to make these deals, to make streaming deals and download to own. And it'll be in tandem with the Blu-ray DVD physical releases and the theatrical screenings.
Okay. Well, on that topic, let's talk about missed opportunities here, because Jesse, I looked at your tweets this afternoon, and you mentioned talking that you found it disappointing that Strictly Canadian service never got it, CBC and Bell, and I can see where you're starting to go with that. And obviously, there's now a little bit of innuendo. We all like to play theories and what have you, and I can see where the missed opportunities on both sides could have been. I mean, with Crave and Bell, they could have leveraged that. They're one of the main sponsors of TIFF. They sponsor the Lighthouse, the main theater for TIFF's year-round activities. And TIFF Lightbox was known to have shown Ghibli films, Ghibli Fest stuff, right?
Yep, and they also had some premieres that other theaters didn't, like Ocean Waves, I remember.
Mm-hmm. So that would have been quite an opportunity just to tie the Bell and Crave names to this. So there was a lot of opportunities there, and you would have thought with all the partnerships that Bell Media have been making, especially with HBO, most notably, because that's a big bone of contention for Canadian consumers. You would have thought they could have been able to get that in some form. What would have happened there? Is it just because they weren't willing? Yeah,
I think you're overestimating how much these dots connect in a massive, vertically integrated conglomerate like Bell. I don't think that whoever works with TIFF under Bell has any connection whatsoever to who deals with Crave or anything like that. The key thing is that Crave has a deal with HBO in the United States, and they really ironed all this out in like late 2018, early 2019, where if you basically, if you subscribe to Crave, you have access to basically all that is HBO for a bit of a premium price. And that deal evolved into their current deal with HBO Max in the United States. And excuse me, probably the main reason that we are not getting HBO Max, which was something that Warner was very unclear about for a number of months. The fact that HBO Max would in fact be a US only service. And it's because the HBO rights are scattered like crazy all over the planet. It's compared to Disney Plus, who reined in their rights for basically everything over the course of a few years before launching the service in a fairly consistent manner everywhere in the world. Well, okay, it's not completely global yet, but I think it's in most major markets now, at least. But Warner's strategy with HBO Max has been US only, which is probably which might be the probably their biggest misstep with all that. But the key thing is that because of that partnership with HBO, Crave made a deal with Warner that they would carry HBO Max content. But the problem is the only content that deal covered, and this was clarified back in late 2019, is that it would cover HBO original content, which with an HBO Max as a service where it includes content from Cartoon Network, it includes content from Adult Swim, Crunchyroll.
Well, Crunchyroll Originals more specifically, right?
No, just Crunchyroll in general. But curated content from all those different services, a lot of content that's not available streaming anywhere else. The HBO Max original content is probably the stuff that people care the least about, and it is the only thing that the deal with Crave actually covered. And it's actually become apparent now that that deal not only didn't cover Studio Ghibli content, it actually didn't cover anything animated on HBO Max, including content that's branded as HBO Max Originals. It does not include Looney Tunes cartoons. It does not include the new Adventure Time miniseries. It does not include any of the new Boondocks, any of the new series that are animated that are coming to HBO Max, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing. Now, we joked actually last episode. The Friends reunion is set to be on HBO Max, right?
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken. Now, that would be hilarious if that didn't make it. But I'd like to think it will. But you never know.
Who knows? I mean, famously, Netflix still has Friends in Canada. So it's a total wild card.
Wrinkle. Yeah, that's the interesting wrinkle in all of that. So, but I grant that I was grasping on straws on where on that. So,
but here's the thing: because of that,
much credit, but I had to start somewhere.
It shows a couple things. One, that Crave doesn't care about animation at all, obviously, and it's anyone's guess who is going to pick up the rights to all that content as it
once you just mentioned.
And also, but it also created a bit of an expectation that Crave would be the service that would get the Studio Ghibli films, and I think you saw a lot of that speculation going on. And in that time, when I think you were going to be moving on to this, after HBO Max announced that they would be streaming the films in the United States, it was announced that Netflix had licensed Studio Ghibli films internationally for streaming everywhere in the world that Netflix is available in, except for the US, Canada, and Japan. And of course, Japan is different because they're the domestic market for Studio Ghibli films. US is covered by HBO Max, but Canada? What about Canada?
Yeah,
what about Canada?
Well, and then of course three other countries, which, well, that's another story altogether.
Yeah, there are 4 countries that Netflix are not available in: Crimea, Syria, North Korea, and China. So those were the other 4 countries where you couldn't stream Studio Ghibli films.
And that is
in any way, yeah.
And how it all settled down was just plain hilarious, and hence where we are now. It's just no one's complaining, though. I don't think anybody's complaining tonight that
one thing that really surprised me was during that period of time where there was no streaming option confirmed, how few people were complaining. I thought people would be more up in arms over the fact that Canada was one of only 5 countries, or 5 or 6 countries on Earth that you couldn't watch. 6 countries on Earth where you couldn't watch Studio Ghibli streaming. But there wasn't like a lot of backlash going on. But when it was announced, there was a lot of celebrating. So,
well, because I think it was, I read those reports, and I think a lot of people are under the assumption we'd see it on Crave through the Max deal. You just explained, obviously, why that wouldn't have been the case, but I remember reading those articles at the time. Well, and again, Crave has shown that they obviously they don't seem to have a lot of priority for animation in general, and as you were alluding to, Bell, and of course CBC, who runs CBC Gem, which would be the other big candidate for hosting or for streaming Studio Ghibli content in Canada. Obviously, despite the fact that Studio Ghibli films are incredibly expensive to license for online streaming, easily companies like Bell and CBC could have afforded those rights. And I have no doubt that they had both looked into the Studio Ghibli films, especially even CBC.
I don't know about CBC because they'd be under the public microscope, because that'd be a big deal. That'd be a lot of money in my mind.
They've licensed other third-party content. So
but that's true, yeah.
British stuff, from what I could gather.
Yeah, but okay, maybe not. Maybe it's not as clear cut as I suggested. But in any case, I have no doubt that they all looked into it, and it's really disappointing because the fact that the most prominent media companies in Canada, at least for English speaking content, wouldn't pay money for Studio Ghibli films, even if it's a lot of money, kind of suggests that they don't see the value in those films, which I think is kind of devastating, especially when, as I go on about in my own podcast, Zannen in Canada, I feel that like the Canadian media ecosystem and the companies that represent it really don't value or understand anime in any way, and the fact that would go as far as like something as well known as the Studio Ghibli films, it's kind of disappointing, because I think it's really important for anime to kind of have a place in that whole ecosystem, and it's just it's so hard for it to carve any kind of space in there. And Studio Ghibli would have been a great opportunity to like kind of get that foot in the door, get a service to get these high profile movies out and available, and also give them data and viewership information establishing that, hey, people like anime, maybe we should pursue this more. Maybe this should be a part of, what media is in Canada, rather than just something people have to get from third party services.
Well, for me, it would have established something with more of a younger demographic that everybody seems to want to try and hook. Like a demographic that's in the 40-ish and younger range. That might have helped there.
And it would be prestige content as well, Mike, because remember, it's like they've been nominated for so many Oscars, and Miyazaki won one for Spirited Away and stuff like that. So they have the pedigree there too, if you think about it.
Well, the other angle to me with the CBC side would have been leveraging any external content. I mean, I just watched the first episode of NHK's 4-part documentary with Hayao Miyazaki, which I know you mentioned to me, Jesse, was actually some compiled stuff.
I mean, NHK filmed a whole bunch of documentary content with Studio Ghibli and Miyazaki back when The Wind Rises was being produced, and most of it has just been cut up and edited into various projects. That's my understanding, at least. Maybe they've done some other things, but like Kingdom of Dreams of Madness and Neverending Man, it's all taken from that same
pool of
that same pool of footage. Yeah.
Well, for reference, the first part of 10 Years with Miyazaki is set in 2006, just as he started to work on Ponyo.
Okay, it goes back even further then, yeah.
And around the time Tales of Earthsea came out. Basically, the two stories in that first part were him trying to get to Ponyo off the ground, and some of the frustrations he had in preparing for that, and also the side story was also his relationship with his son. As Tales of Earthsea came out, and you realize there isn't really a warm relationship between the two, between Hayao and Goro. It was pretty eye-opening.
I'd be surprised if there was a warm relationship between Hayao Miyazaki and anyone. Frankly,
that too. Yeah,
it's like he in recent years he had started to gain that reputation of not being the most cuddly character to deal with. I can start to see it in that
he
documentary.
was a man of his age, that's for sure.
That's one way to put it, actually. But from that documentary, as I watch it, because I watched it just before we came on air tonight, and all those stories about having to convince him on streaming services, I could start to see why you had to kind of sell him on that. Just the way he acted in that.
I mean, the story that was making the rounds was the fact that Toshio Suzuki was able to convince Hayao Miyazaki to make the films available streaming simply because he didn't really understand what online streaming was, which is, obviously I'm sure that there was more to the discussion that went on than that, but
yeah, there's probably more to it, but Suzuki's definitely the one that's the business side of it, and probably he pushed through some of that. But there have been weird stories I know with Suzuki. You remember about the merchandising and stuff like that, where they said they could only hit a certain amount of profit and stuff like that for their merchandising, and Suzuki just didn't go to those meetings for a few years, so people kept on pushing stuff out into the market, and when he saw, he's like, what the bleep is this, guys? It's like, where did all this money come from? And so a lot of people got in trouble for that. There's some crazy stories like that.
Well,
I can't remember what period of time that was. It was probably in the aughts, and then the early part of this decade, I'm sure.
Well, keep in mind, like I have a lot to catch up on. I mean, the end of the aughts is when I actually stopped for a while watching, and basically the purgatory of this podcast happened around the same time, right? So, just going through the list, it's 20. They say 21 features. Do we want to list all 21 that was in the Twitter entry today? Just quickly. Never mind. I think most people know anyway.
The only one is that The Wind Rises is going to be on August 1st and stuff like that. And we don't know why that is. We do know that maybe it's to tie in with the fact that the Blu-ray DVD is being re-released by G-Kids in September. But for whatever reason, it's going to be the last one to come out.
Disney released that one under Touchstone back in the day, so that may have caused like a delay in the rights being transferred. That's speculation, but
yeah. That's a very likely. Yeah, I could see that for sure.
Yeah, and also worth emphasizing that Grave of the Fireflies is of course not a part of this deal because it's always been separate.
Yeah, and Sentai has it, and I don't think they're letting their paws off that since they did a re-release of a steelbook of that in February, and they want that thing that says produced by Studio Ghibli, which is prominently featured on that one too.
Which is really funny because their first Blu-ray release of that actually misspelled Isao Takahata's name on the copy on the back.
You know what they call that, Jesse, especially in the video game community? Collector's edition to sell for a lot of money because of spelling mistakes, just like Resident Evil.
Kevin can kind of attest to that. Kevin, you have something to mention?
Oh, I was just saying how I took a quick look on High Dive, and it's not streaming there either. Grave of the Fireflies, that is.
Really?
Yeah, no, it's not.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, no.
So that's just not an option right now, streaming, is it? Doesn't sound like it.
No.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm looking through the list one more time, and I mean, it's an extensive list. It seems like, I mean, top to bottom. Ocean Waves is mentioned. I mean, I've always mentioned that's still a personal favorite of mine, so it's mentioned.
That was an interesting one, Mike, because as I said, I think they only had 2 showings here in Ontario, and they were all at TIFF Lightbox and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So. And we never thought that was going to come, too, because that's one of the few ones that's sub-only, right? And you always think of Studio Ghibli, that they always put out a nice dub and stuff like that with it. But that one's a tough one to sell to anyone I know.
It's just a very weird film.
Not even a film, it's a TV special.
It is a TV special.
It is a special. So.
Yes, but I for some strange reason, I really liked it. That's just me. Well, is there, like I've already mentioned mine, but I'll probably mention two more. Is there a title in this list that you think people don't really know about, or that's kind of
Only
under the radar that you
yesterday.
would want to say just for a watch on Thursday?
Only yesterday.
Only yesterday,
Yeah.
in your case, James. Just
It's
one
hard
title.
to say because a lot of them have been out and recommended to people for a number of years and stuff like that. So I think I say most people have probably already seen. But if I think about one off the top of my head, I would say take a look at My Neighbors, the Yamadas, because that's a
Okay,
comedy one and it's a very different style compared to any of the other Ghibli films.
Jesse.
Yeah, statistically speaking, you there's the highest chance that that a person hasn't watched, you know, Only Yesterday or Ocean Waves or My Neighbors the Yamadas. So unless there's something else you haven't watched, you should definitely watch one of those ones.
For me, well, only because I just watched the documentary and it was based around that time frame. I'm now really curious to see both Tales of Earthsea and Ponyo, just because they're the two in the order, and they were the subject of the first part of 10 Years with Miyazaki.
I'll have to
So
admit, Tales from Earthsea is the one I have never watched, and I still don't really intend to.
yeah, it's just everything that surrounds. We can get a sense of the internal strife that kind of surrounded that film, with in terms of Goro and Hayao. I mean, Miyazaki was known to not want him to be involved in such a way. I mean, that's an old story, and we get to see some of that story play out in the documentary.
Yeah, and also there's his second film from Up on Poppy Hill that
Mhm,
I think has been not as widely seen as
mhm. That's
a lot of the
mentioned
older
as
work. So
that's
That
in the list, of
that
course.
one I was very fond of. It kind of reminds me of Only Yesterday in the sense that like it's of a bygone time, and in this, I believe it was the '60s for Poppy Hill, and it really
so
just
a very surprising depiction of the '60s. Not something
Mhm.
you'd ever see in like anime that was made in the '60s. Not the world they wanted to portray in those kinds of shows.
Okay. Well, that's as much as I want to talk about. Is there anything else we want to bring up concerning all of this? Because I think like looking at my stuff. Oh, there's one final note. Oh, this is going back a second, and this is in my own show notes, and it's kind of beating a dead horse. So I may actually omit it in the post production. There's a note here that I wrote that said, "What was the possibility Crunchyroll would have gotten in on this? Maybe not. I mean that we've gone too far down the conversation to have ever
for
talked
just
about that."
Canada, not likely.
No, they wanted like a more general release and stuff like that. I don't think they would go for a niche streaming platform.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to really galaxy brain it, I mean, there could have been the possibility that HBO Max had licensed the U.S. and Canadian rights from G Kids, and but then of course they don't have an outlet. Without HBO Max, there's no proper outlet, but because they have they're owned by the same company, or
Yeah,
rather,
that's
HBO
why.
Max and Crunchyroll are owned by the same company. They would have just thrown it out on Crunchyroll. That would have been a very bad move because, again, you're reaching a niche audience, whereas those films really need to be on a service that
The general service.
a much more general service.
Mhm.
On that note, it's probably worth emphasizing that the because I don't think we touched on this earlier. The rights for the Studio Ghibli films are different inside the U.S. and Canada and outside. In Canada and the U.S., it's owned by G Kids. Outside of Canada and the U.S., the films are owned by a company called The Wild Bunch, which is one out of
Okay.
France. When Netflix licensed the Studio Ghibli films for international streaming, they did it through The Wild Bunch. So to get these films on Netflix, uh, obviously required a completely separate deal with G Kids. So it's kind of a separate thing from what we're seeing internationally. They probably had to pay a considerable sum just for the Canadian rights specifically, whereas they probably got like more of a package deal for the rest of the world, which is kind of funny, but at least they were willing to pay for it.
Yeah, it was. Okay, well, that's as much as I want to talk about on the Ghibli deal. As I said, something to look forward to on Thursday. So good news if you're a Canadian anime fan. But boy, we kind of had to go through a bunch of detours to get here.
Yeah. I mean, I have most of the movies on Blu-ray anyway, and that's probably how I'll continue to watch them. But
Oh, no,
I'm glad that a broader audience has access to them on Netflix now.
That's the thing. Well, I got the original Disney releases of a lot of them, and I even got some of the actual Japanese DVDs. Strangely, too, at the time. Okay, so well, almost done, but as I said, thanks a lot, Jesse, for doing this on very short notice. I do want you to give you a chance to give a plug for Zannen Canada, because actually I did listen to the latest episode earlier today when
Yeah,
they talked about Macross Plus.
yeah. So if you don't know who I am, I run my own podcast called Zannen Canada, which explores the connections between anime and Canadian media. We do, I do interviews with like voice actors or people who have been involved in similar productions in some capacity. We do retrospectives on shows that have had a notable cultural impact in Canada. The latest one is on Macross Plus. To be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely happy with how that episode turned out. I was a little unprepared, and I don't think I had the best notes or touched all the best points when going through it, and focusing mainly on when Macross Plus aired on Teletoon back in the late 90s. But I also recently did an episode looking at Minifay, which is the Quebec produced dub of Sally the Witch, which is the first ever Magical Girl anime, and that was actually also the first ever Canadian produced dub for an anime, also the first dub ever produced in the French language, and quite possibly the first anime dub ever produced by a woman as well. I can't 100% confirm that; it's difficult to, but that does seem to be the case from what I've seen. So check out that episode for sure if you haven't. And yeah, I got a couple cool interviews coming up soon. I don't want to say what they are because I haven't recorded them yet, and no telling what's going to happen. But yeah, keep your eye on it. You can find Zannen Canada at zannen.ca. Subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Yeah.
Yes.
And pretty much anywhere else you can find podcasts. You can find Zannen Canada.
Well, as I said, you're selling yourself short, I think. I enjoyed the Macross episode, just for reference. I know you said it wasn't the most well-researched, but you did make me say, a couple of times, and that's always worth something, at least to me.
I wish we had talked more about Bryan Cranston and how I want to see Bryan Cranston do more comedy again.
Oh, yeah. Wouldn't that be interesting? No, considering all the stuff he has done. Like, that man is...
Yeah, he's quite a success story. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's you took the words out of my mouth. You did. And also, just for reference, Jesse, I know you can brag a little bit because this whole discussion we just had on Ghibli stuff, in many respects, you had earlier this year. If you want to plug that.
Episode 65. I mean, usually at some point early in the year, we do a lot of speculating about what we think is going to happen with anime. We know with things like streaming rights or broadcast or anything, we're usually wrong about our predictions, like 95% of the time. So we just kind of this year, what we did in episode 65, we just talked about a bunch of things like is Canada going to get Toonami? What's going to happen with the Studio Ghibli films? What's going to happen with the Viz content on Hulu in the States that we still can't watch here? And that's probably still the biggest problem with accessing anime in Canada is that goddamn Viz content. And we just thought of every possible outcome that could happen for all those situations and laid them out. And as I mentioned earlier, Netflix getting Studio Ghibli films, that wound up being a pretty strong possibility. We pretty much determined it was either going to be Crave or Netflix. So like I said, not obvious, right? Not surprised that it wound up on Netflix. I thought it was going to take a little longer, but no, we got them pretty quickly, which is nice.
No, as I said, it was good news, but you can toot your own horn, or you've sort of earned that today.
Sure.
Well, that's about it, I suppose. Nothing else to really talk about. As I said, one topic to plug, and that's about it. So, any other thoughts though before we go? Nothing else?
No,
I'll say one thing.
Sure, go ahead.
In terms of underrated stuff, I would say just watch any of Takahata's stuff.
I mean, if you want to go really underrated, watch Takahata's stuff from before he was involved with, or before Studio Ghibli opened. Chie the Brat, or Gauche the Cellist, or Horace, Prince of the Sun. Actually, you can't buy most of those. You can get Horace. That is on Blu-ray from Discotheque.
Yeah.
Did that one show up on Retro Crush? I don't think it did.
I didn't
I
see
don't
it, but
recall.
you never know. It might.
Who knows?
It'll probably be on Retro Crush eventually. I wish his older films would get licensed here, especially Chie the Brat. But I imagine there's some obstacles towards that.
Jesse, I owe you a coffee sometime. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. I'd appreciate it.
I'll send that along sometime. Okay, check's in the mail. Thanks for doing this, Jesse.
No problem. Always a pleasure.
James, Kevin, thanks for doing it on such short notice as well.
No problem.
You're welcome.
That's pretty much it. That's all we have for this episode. Thanks for listening. Have a good night, folks.